Hello, everybody. It's your teacher, Dumbledore. It says there's people here, but oh, there they come. Happy Halloween. Can you all hear me tonight? Oh, I gotta use some magic here and recline my chair. I don't see any messages on here. Oh, here we go.
They're just Snapchatting you right now.
I'm just getting so old I don't know how to use this computer. Oh, 7 followers. I got a new beanie. Ooh. Will somebody type something in the chat so that I can see that this is working correctly? All I see is live chat now. Oh, Izzy, thank you. Good. This beard is terrible. Okay. Since Professor Binns is not here, I'll be giving you your history lesson tonight. We're reviewing for the Chapter 9 and 10 test tomorrow. I have a bit of bad news for myself. I won't be in attendance tomorrow. My daughter's taken ill with strep throat. But you all will be just fine without me. You'll be just fine without me. There'll be a sub, and they will give you your passwords. And if you have any questions, you can talk to me on Tuesday morning. But these are the way things go. So, anyway. No. My wife is sewing me another robe. I don't know if you can see this glorious thing here. This is homemade, custom-made robes by Mrs. Hofer. Okay. Well, let's start with your questions. Yes, Claire, you can turn your papers in to turnitin.com. You know, as I had said, I would prefer that you I would prefer that you focus on the test tonight and do a good job with that tomorrow. And if you need to turn it in to turnitin.com, I think I moved the deadline for that to be Tuesday morning. But yes, it does need to be turned in there, and I will use that as a way of giving you feedback. Mikey, how are you? How was your vacation? Okay, summarize the XYZ affair, and I'll tell you why it's important too. Okay, we have to remember that France was giving the United States quite a bit of difficulty after we refused to support it in the French Revolution. And this is during the presidency of John Adams. And there we go. That's better. Much better. Okay. Presidency of John Adams. And we are no longer the strongest. We're no longer part of the strongest empire. So the United States is left to negotiate with the foreign minister of France, whose name is Talleyrand. And us being a small fry, we were expected to pay what amounted to a tribute or a bribe in order to even meet with their foreign minister, who would be like our Secretary of State. Okay, so we had to pay this bribe, and the American public got wind of it. The fact that we were being expected to pay tribute to meet with the French foreign minister really upset Federalists, especially the high Federalists like Alexander Hamilton. And even though you think about President Washington had wanted to avoid war, the high Federalists now, led by Alexander Hamilton, really were pushing for war with France. President Adams, we know one thing about him, and that's he's very unpopular. And he does the unpopular thing by staying out of the conflict. So not only is he unpopular with the anti-Federalists, but now he's unpopular with a big faction of the Federalists too. This became known as the XYZ affair because the French diplomats, the report on these French diplomats was anonymous. And so the diplomats were identified anonymously by the letters X, Y, and Z. Okay. And so this particular conflict, though, became a thorn in the side of Adams. We talked about how the Adams administration and the Federalists did not like to be criticized in the press. And so Adams supports the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Sedition Act being to prohibit criticism of the national government in the press in times of conflict, which this was, because it would be considered seditious or an attempt to overthrow the government. Does that make sense? But it's a violation. You know, we think about it today. If we weren't allowed to publish criticisms of the government, I don't know what we would spend our time on Facebook doing. But certainly it's protected under our First Amendment rights. And the anti-Federalists, as you remember, insisted on a Bill of Rights. So Mike, you give me some sense of if I've explained it well enough. I guess I'll continue. You're welcome. The alien part of that, of course, it made it more difficult for immigrants to come into this country. I think it's such a important moment right now as President Trump talks about the caravan of migrants that are traveling up through Mexico. The fear and concern that immigrants moving into the United States were a threat to national security. And so President Adams passes the Alien Act, which really slows down the process of repatriate or allowing people to migrate to the United States. And really, it's a political thing because immigrants tended to vote with the Anti-Federalists. They were supportive of farmers' lifestyle, and every immigrant that was coming here was hoping to be, an independent landowner. The Anti-Federalists also supported lower limits on people's ability to vote, so lower property requirements and that type of thing. So typically, immigrants voted Anti-Federalist, and we have to remember Democratic Republicans are the party name that the Jeffersonians start to adopt for themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just want to type your questions in the chat, and I will address them as they come up. That way we can go from one thing to the next, and sometimes I can tie them together and that kind of thing. The compact theory, yes. And this is going to be something that's important. It's going to be something that's important as we move into Jefferson's administration and as we move into, closer and closer to the Civil War. Compact is another word for contract, okay? And any contract has two or more parties coming together for a mutual agreement. They both are supposed to give something, and they are both supposed to take something. Jefferson and Madison start writing about how the states came into this contract or the compact with one another freely. We had 13 states, as you remember, agree to become one United States of America under the new Constitution, right? In the Constitution, there's verbiage about how new states can come into the Union. The assumption by Madison and Jefferson is that people can enter into a contract freely and they can leave a contract freely. So maybe you can see where I'm going with this. This idea that if any of the states that come into the Union voluntarily are unhappy, or if they don't like a particular federal law, that they can exit from that union freely, or they can, this is going to be strongly tied to nullification as we get into Jefferson and Jackson. Andrew Jackson nearly had a civil war on his hands as the southern states tried to nullify his actions with the national bank. So, this is just introducing us to the national bank and this idea of who's supreme, the state or the national government. Everything we're doing is a precedent. And so compact theory, just to reiterate, is this idea the states come in voluntarily, and so they have the power to leave or overrule federal law voluntarily because they're still independent. Does that make sense, Izzy? Yeah. And then the one example in chapter 10 that deals with the compact theory are the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Kentucky and Virginia, these were authored by Jefferson anonymously, and they declare the Alien Acts to be unconstitutional. Okay. Who today has the authority? What body in the national government has the ability to declare an act of Congress or the enforcement of a law by the president unconstitutional? Who would we think normally has that power? I'm hoping you're telling yourselves that it's the Supreme Court. That we're going to get to those precedences soon. Under the Jefferson administration, we're going to see the court case of Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court takes for itself the power of judicial review. Anti-federalists, Democratic Republicans, thought that the states had the power to override, declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. I do have the power. Thank you. I do. Where's my wand? Yes. I will tell those unconstitutional laws, Avada Kedavra. They blow up. Zombie butt killer. Oh, Zomboot. I'm going to guess it's zombie butt killer. Very nice. Creative. Okay, next question. Oh, I've got 20 viewers. Must be. I will gladly wear a costume every review session if it gives us 20 viewers or more. Do you like my beanie? Okay, well, I will. By the way, commenting does not work on school Chromebooks. I don't know if there is a way that there are a few of you that are logged in with your personal accounts, and hopefully those of you that can't comment can see who is commenting and send them a text message or something like that and have them post it. I don't know. BHS has its rules, social media rules, and who are we to disagree with those? But maybe now is the good time to log in with your personal account. I won't be here tomorrow. As I've said, my youngest daughter has strep throat, and she's with Madame Pomfrey right now, but she plans to return home, and I must help her heal. But I will give the sub your password so you can log into the test. Halloween, I think I should. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't BHS kind of a killjoy about costumes on Halloween too? Okay, well, we could call it history. Oh, I got to show you something. I can't help but use. This isn't even my real Dumbledore voice. When I read to my daughter, I talk like this, much more wispy, but I didn't know if you could actually hear me. Okay. But I do have something to show you. I was so proud of this young man that we did the trunk or treat at Pine Creek tonight, and there's this little boy walking around. I don't know if you can see him. How about that? Guess who my favorite trick-or-treater was? I kept shouting at him, "Watch out for Aaron Burr." But he dressed up as Alexander Hamilton. He was happy to. I was the first person who knew who he was. Okay, let's keep marching on because I'm sure that this novelty will wear off very soon. Questions? State constitutional conventions and their influence on the national government. Don't forget the influence of Massachusetts on creating constitutional conventions. Constitutional conventions where a group of delegates write a constitution, and then before they become the law of the land, they have to be ratified. At the state level, they were ratified by the voters. Our constitutional convention, we've talked about that. Once the Constitutional Convention was finished with the document, it had to go to the states, and the states had to ratify it. And most of the states held elections for their ratifying conventions. So people would run as a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist, and people elected Federalists and Anti-Federalists to go to their state ratifying conventions. And that then decided whether or not the state would adopt it. And let's just remember that it wasn't until 1788 that it was finally ratified by 9. And really the thing that pushed it over the edge was that the Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights once it was adopted. So once 9 states had ratified it, it became the law of the land, and that left us the 4 laggard states, meaning those lagging behind. You've heard the word lag behind. My internet is lagging. That actually is a short for laggard, and laggard means slow. So there were 4: Virginia, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and New York. Let's not forget that the New York delegate who was in favor of ratification, Alexander Hamilton, led the charge then to write the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers really give us insight into this defense of how we would have a Republican government, but at the same time, one that was effective in its executive function, but limited, that it would create a system of checks and balances that would internally limit the ability for the government to become too powerful. So I will take breaths every once in a while when I finish what I think you want to hear, or what I think is important. And please keep typing your comments in. Can we go over the Constitutional Convention and the influence on the national? Oh, okay. I was kind of doing that. Okay. Good question, Miley. So let's talk about what was happening for the first time with the states. Okay. So after the passage of the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress. So I'm rewinding the clock to 1776 with the passage of the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress asked the states all to hold constitutional conventions of their own to create new constitutions. And here are some of the novelties that we should point out. Number one, they would all write constitutions. This was a break from England because England has a unwritten constitution. It's a laundry list of laws, precedents, and different legal opinions that create what we were referring to as the rights of Englishmen. So Americans, for the first time, start writing constitutions, one succinct document that's going to act as the law of the land. It takes priority over all laws that will be passed by lawmaking bodies. Okay, so it's not very long, written on parchment. It was 8 sheets of parchment long, something like that. So pretty short. And it takes the amendment process to change it. So Constitutions cannot be easily amended. As we know, we've only amended ours 27 times in the history of America. Okay, so they're written. Most states included a Bill of Rights. States' constitutions would lay out what the functions of government were, what the rights of the people were, what the role the people had in choosing their governments, and they all had to be republican forms of government. That means people would elect representatives to run their state governments. Some of them were completely overhauled. Massachusetts starts from the ground floor and rewrites their whole constitution. It's the oldest written constitution in the history of the world today. Others, like Rhode Island, which had always been pretty democratic and liberal in allowing people to participate, only tweaked theirs somewhat. Okay. So when it comes time for the actual Constitutional Convention, 1787. When it comes time for the actual Constitutional Convention of the United States, there's a framework for how it's done. And that's why we have the writing process followed by the ratification process. Any more questions about that? Miley, do you want me to go over the different debates? Is that what you were trying to get at, the debates of the Constitutional Convention? Okay, well, I'll keep going until I have somebody post something again. Hopefully now we understand how the Constitutional Convention, the creation of the new government, was actually a conservative movement compared to the independence movement, which was a liberal movement. Think about if liberal politics push for government change that brings about more equality and participation in politics. The revolution was that, or the whole foundation of Republican government brought about a number of changes amongst the states where property requirements were lowered. There were times where even women were allowed to vote in certain states, but the creation of bills of rights, the limiting of the executive function of government, all of those are very progressive. But also the Articles of Confederation made a very unstable society economically. And this is why we get the reaction, the kickback, the pendulum swings to the right with the Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, you have to remember, a year before the Constitutional Convention, were part of the Annapolis Conference, where they were trying to figure out how can we fix the economy? How can we get a government that does a better job of negotiating trade deals for... Our cat is attacking my wife. Sorry. Yeah, so to get a government that negotiates trade deals, has a stable currency, manages the nation's finances better. This is a conservative swing. And we know also with the Constitution, it limits popular participation at the national level. We got the Electoral College. Originally, the Senate was chosen by state governments. Today, we elect the Senate, but originally, it was state lawmakers that picked the members of the Senate. Judges are appointed, so there are quite a few appointed positions in the national government that people never have a say on. And so those are all conservative elements to create a unified currency, that type of thing. Yes, the Great Compromise. I remember it well. 1787 in the Constitutional Convention. I was just a young man. Of course, the Constitutional Convention was closed-doored meeting, so I had to appaporate in so that I could actually listen to what was going on. But here's the situation. So there were a series of debates in the Constitutional Convention, and the first being about how states would be represented in the lawmaking body of government. We have the Virginia Plan that was put forward by James Madison. It created a bicameral legislature. That means two chambers. We got a bicycle with two wheels. We got bifocals for both your eyes, bicameral legislature, and Virginia wanting to have more representation because of its large population. In both chambers, the states would be represented proportionately. That didn't sit well with the smaller states who had grown accustomed to having equal say. And so New Jersey put together a proposal of their own. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had been represented with one vote. New Jersey wanted a unicameral legislature. So, you think unibrow, unicameral means one. And in each of those, or in that unicameral, each state would get 2 votes. So it was at an impasse, big states against small states. And Connecticut, which was rapidly growing, being attached to New York, came up with a compromise using Madison's plan. Oh, hi, Kara Apala. Welcome. So Connecticut came up with a good plan that used Madison's bicameral legislature, and in the upper chamber, the Senate, named after the Roman Senate, the more prestigious of the chambers, each state had two votes. And in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, each state would be represented proportionately. Now, because of the whole to-do over taxes with Great Britain, and the fact that the more people you have, the more taxes you pay, the Continental Congress felt it was, or the Constitutional Convention felt it was important to put the power of taxation in the hands of the House of Representatives. And that's the Great Compromise. Sometimes it's called the Connecticut Compromise, but it really used Madison's framework. But a guy by the name of Roger Sherman was the one that put it together. What's next? Does that make sense, McKenna? Okay. Whiskey tax. Right. So Alexander Hamilton, of course, is the financial brains of the Federalist Party, wanted to create a system where our nation could build credit by taking on debt. So hopefully you understand the assumption plan. And I was just going to say that. And if you don't understand the assumption plan, let me know. I'll explain it. But taking on debt, our states had gotten really good at taking on debt to the point where they couldn't take on any more debt. And the new national government was looking to build credit. But in order to build credit, not only do you need debt, but you need a way to pay your bills as well. And so Hamilton proposed an excise tax, meaning a tax on some kind of consumable good. And so not everyone's paying it. If you don't drink whiskey, you don't pay the tax. But this particular tax on whiskey came at a great expense to farmers because in the West, corn, grains, those types of things, to transport them over the rugged roads was quite a to-do. So it was much easier to transport grain in a bottle. And furthermore, you think about, it's a pretty decent product that people like, whiskey, and it holds a good value. And so farmers had started using whiskey as a form of currency. And all of a sudden, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington are taxing whiskey, and it made them angry. And of course, through the Revolution, anyone that was angry grabbed their rifle and went and stuck it in the face of the closest lawmaker, and that was called patriotism. But now under this new national government, of course, these rebellions were testing the security of our nation. And so Washington sent out a detachment of the federal military, and it went to Pennsylvania and stopped the rebellion. And it's also important to note, this really shows the effectiveness of the centralized government, because we had that Shays Rebellion before that had caused quite a bit of problems, but the national government couldn't respond to it. Is it better to listen to history when I ramble on like an old man, and makes it seem more authentic, doesn't it? Maybe if I fall asleep. Carson, did I get that all for you? So oftentimes the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion are used as an example of before and after the Constitution. You know, two similar situations juxtaposed. Okay. Is he faithful opposition? And this is something we'll talk about more as we get into chapter 11. But you have to remember, the whole creation of the Constitution came from people who wanted the same thing. They wanted a stronger national government. I think your book says they were all nationalists, right? They all supported some improvement. And the original intention of the Constitutional Convention was to improve the Articles of Confederation. So they were all on the same team, in other words. Now, there were some that wanted stronger central government, and there were some that didn't want it as strong. And we get the federalist, anti-federalist attitudes developing around the time of ratification. But even after that, there was not a real strong sense that parties would ever develop. In fact, partisan politics or factionalism was something considered to be quite a taboo. The framers thought that factionalism would lead to civil war and disunity and that kind of thing. And so the notion that they would create a government with two permanent political parties seemed foreign and really dangerous. So we fast forward into the Washington administration, the end of it, and the beginning of the Adams administration. We know Jefferson resigns from Washington's administration and plans to run for president. And he's building quite a following of anti-federalists. They're starting to call themselves Democratic Republicans. And they feel it's their responsibility to challenge the authority and challenge the the platform, the politics of the Federalists. So no one is really certain through Adams' administration that if a Democratic Republican will ever be elected, would it mean civil war? And we're going to get to 1800, and Jefferson is going to be elected, and people hold their breath because the thought is, will the Federalists give up the power of the government peacefully? And they do. So sometimes the election of 1800 is considered the bloodless revolution or the great revolution of 1800, that one party comes in, another party leaves peacefully. And this is the American system that we really ought to be proud of. This idea that we can have opposing sides and one side puts pressure on the other side faithfully. It's not about dividing the nation into parts that will go to war with one another, but that you do your best, you run an election, you put out the opposing positions, and the American people decide. And that's an act of patriotism, not of treason. Make sense? It's a beautiful thing. You know, I put on here the Electoral College, and I know that your government teachers will teach you more in depth about the Electoral College, but we need to remember the Electoral College and the Senate were created with limited participation by the average person. You know, popular sovereignty, the people rule, that was a scary idea. So I want to talk a little bit about the Democratic Republicans and the ideal American, economic democracy, Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton and Jefferson appeal to different kinds of people. Hamilton wanting to build the banks for stable credit, supportive of bankers and lenders and big merchants, and creating a stronger industrial center, appealed to people in urban areas in the city along the eastern seaboard, you know, the Atlantic elite, so to speak. And Jefferson, on the other hand, you know, from the South, appealed to Southerners and Westerners and wrote extensively about how the romantic idea of what a real American ought to be, what the greatest kind of American is the independent farmer. And the reason he felt that way, you know, banker, their job is all on paper. They don't own anything that in his mind, that land is really the one thing that you can own and work and improve. And that kind of investment makes you a concerned citizen. I don't know how many of you know farmers, but they fight the land. They work for every little bit that they can get. It's a tough lifestyle, but it makes them incredibly sensitive to political change, and that creates good citizenship. So Jefferson encouraged people to become landowners. He thought economic democracy, people improving themselves economically, would come before political democracy. But at the same time, he warned the nation that should slavery end, it would be devastating to economic democracy, because if you free a whole bunch of African Americans and they are competing with the poorest white Americans for land and opportunity, it is just going to swell the ranks of the bottom class, and it's going to make for a bunch of people who are not politically invested and who are more or less dangerous to the nation. The attitude that those who own the government ought to run it was pretty consistent amongst both groups. It's just a matter of what level of ownership. Federalists, especially people like Hamilton, were really elitists. Well, I'm feeling pretty good about how I've covered everything through class. I mean, we took an extra week, but I can't say there's anything on the study guide outside of those things we've already talked about from the Adams administration that concern me a tremendous amount for you guys. Let's see. Oh, slavery. Let's talk about slavery for a moment with the Constitutional Convention. So we've talked about how the first big debate was over how states would be represented in the legislative branch. And another major hurdle was how slavery would fit into the whole equation. When you're talking about taxes and you're talking about representation, the issue of slavery gets brought up because the South wants all of their slaves counted in their population, and their argument is that they pay taxes per head. They pay taxes on their slaves, and when it comes time to count heads for taxes, the slaves are counted as part of that total. And so they want their slaves to be counted when it comes to representation in Congress as well. And of course, Northerners think that this is just a power grab. But without the Southern states, there is no hope for ratification. And so another compromise takes place. Slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person. And even though the word slave doesn't actually show up in this particular part of the Constitution, it says, and 3/5 of all other people, it was very clear to everyone who this was meant to be for. Slavery is protected also in a number of other ways. Number one, that there's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution that says that states can't deny, or that states must assist people from other states who have slaves that have run away. It prohibits Congress from abolishing the international slave trade. So you think about, there's still ships coming from Africa with new slaves to the United States, and it prohibits Congress from doing anything about that until 1807, and which they will do right away. In 1807, when this clause is expired, they'll prohibit the international slave trade. But by that time, there are so many African Americans in the continent that the foreign slave trade is really unnecessary at that point, as far as the slave owners were concerned. So it is important to note that, because there are questions that will ask, about the role of slavery and the agreements and things that were made, and why the Constitutional Convention didn't do away with slavery in the first part. Don't forget about the Articles of Confederation. There are some strengths to the Articles of Confederation, right? Very few, but the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance. So the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance divided the land into townships, and each township was, 36 square miles. And so every 16th section was set aside for public education. That the plan for assessing and selling the land was set up in the Land Ordinance of 85. And then with the Northwest Ordinance of 87, slavery was abolished in that particular territory. And it created, but more importantly, well, that's important. I can't say that it's more importantly, but also very importantly, the Northwest Ordinance set up the plan for admitting new territory into the Union. Well, Dumbledore is feeling like he's worked his magic. I'm happy to take any further questions. Oh, the founding fathers were elite. They were the best of the best. Jefferson called them a convention of demigods. In a time where so few people were literate, let alone college graduates, over half of the delegates were had graduated some kind of professional school, law school mostly attorneys. But very wealthy and knowledgeable. Most of them had experience in lawmaking. Well, I'll hang out for maybe 2 more minutes to see if there are any further questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I hope you all have a lovely evening. And tomorrow, don't be too hard on the sub. I've divided the tests. So when you go into Moodle, you'll see that there's a test for each period instead of just one link. For all classes, there's one link for each period. And so that's not a huge deal, but just pick the one that goes with your period. She or he will give you the password. So my daughters are going as, Aubrey is going for Halloween as Winky, the house elf, the drunk little house elf. And Alice is going as Draco Malfoy. And my wife is going as Professor Trelawney, the divination teacher. She's got the glasses and everything. If I do this, now I've got a costume for Moses. Okay, well, I hope you all have a magical evening. And I will see you on Tuesday. Good night.